Hello, everyone. Today we're joined with Tim O'Reilly, who is the creator and founder of the O'Reilly Media Group, and one of the people who wrote some of the programming books you've probably read when you began your journey in coding. And so we're really lucky today to have him on our show in order to discuss how he created his media group, how he got into publishing, and then some of the work he's doing right now, like the AI Disclosures product. Tim, would you like to introduce maybe a few things about yourself before we continue?
Sure. I basically started working with computers in my mid-20s, but I was not actually originally trained as a computer scientist. I was actually studied Greek and Latin classics in college, and I had a friend who was a programmer who got asked to write a manual, and he didn't know what he was doing, so I said I'd help him out, and we went in as a team, and I thought they were talking gibberish to me, but I was used to foreign languages, so I eventually figured it out, and very rapidly fell in love with technology, and so that's kind of how I began. So I wasn't that much older than you guys, but I wasn't one of these kids who had my a home computer and got started in my teens.
Yeah, so I'm interested in like what your first projects maybe were with coding and how you got involved after you started helping out with your friends.
Well, the very first work I had was really writing Fortran programs for a manual I was writing. But the first stuff that I really got and fell in love with was actually text processing, and in particular Unix text processing. And a lot of what I was doing in those days was it was sort of home rolled tools to help my documentation business. So I don't know how much you guys still use the kind of stuff that was back there in the old command line days, but Unix included some very, very powerful editing tools like sed and awk. And so I would write these. I remember once indexing a 2,000 page manual in an all-nighter by just writing scripts. And of course we were using markup languages. TROF at that point, not tech, but markup languages gave you lots of handles for pattern recognition. So regular expressions and text processing were my jam. I did a lot of very big complex shell scripts to help with our business. I also wrote, that was an early PC-based database program called DBase2, back actually on, not before, this is before MS-DOS, it was on what was called CPM, the CPM operating system, and I wrote the accounting, system for my early business using that. And then and just one of the things that was unique about Unix that you don't quite understand today is that Unix was the first common operating system that ran on many different kinds of hardware, which meant that in order to the PC wasn't dominant, so there were every time you got a new program, you generally had to port it to your architecture. So I did a lot of porting of C programs, which was a lot of I didn't necessarily even have to know what I was doing that much. Just you figure out what error is it throwing and how to fix it, and you go, okay, I now got this. I got UECP running on my Convergent Technologies mainframe. It didn't come with it, and you get a copy of the source code and you hack around with it till you get it running. So a lot of that kind of stuff.
When you began doing a lot of this documentation work and a lot of this like Unix work, was this before you started O'Reilly Media? And if it was, what was this a part of?
Well, originally I had I was the junior partner with this programmer in this tech writing consulting firm, but he never did learn to write, and a lot of what we ended up doing was documentation. So we eventually split up the partnership, and I kept going. And that's why it was originally called Brager O'Reilly and Associates, and then it just became O'Reilly and Associates. And very early on, I realized that first of all, I wanted to build products, not just have a consulting business. And I realized that many people were, because Unix had come out of Bell Labs, there wasn't really any good documentation. And all these companies, as they were starting to commercialize it, they were having to write manuals. And so we started writing. I basically my original business model was to change. Was to I'd offer to write a manual for someone, and I could say, well, I'll do it for you for a discount if I can retain the rights so I can resell it to someone else. And so it was really a licensing business. And then we realized that we could actually turn some of them into books, and that's where the book business came from. But even in there, the book business ran in parallel with this licensing business. We did a set of manuals for the X Window system, for example, that we sold. We licensed the source code to companies, and we also sold the print books. And eventually, people said, "Well, why would we want to, print them ourselves if we can just buy them from you?" And it was sort of interesting because it's one of these evolution of business models. Back then, most people printed their manuals on, like, it might even be on a dot matrix printer. It wasn't, and we actually were early on to have, laser printers, and we had TROF to do typesetting. And so we could, produce better looking, texts. So they would have to warehouse them and inventory them. And we thought, well, why wouldn't they buy a license for $50,000? Instead, Sun Microsystems will pay us $1 million for, for tens of thousands of books. But when you understood what their costs were, it made a lot of sense. But so we kind of backed into publishing in a certain way.
When you began doing like these big documentation pushes, when you had like these like old school matrix printers and like you had the special typesetting you had back then, how long did it take to necessarily like make, let's say, documentation for some Unix system you're trying to publish?
Well, I mean, a typical, consulting documentation project was about 6 months. But what we started doing for ourselves was we realized that there were these individual Unix utilities, and we wrote small books about them. It was actually inspired by, again, we were just out there in the market, and we're just getting ideas from trying things. We had a company that wrote software for traders on Wall Street, and they wanted a little manual that they could slip under their keyboard, and that planted the idea of little books. And we started thinking about, well, could we make little books that you could sell in a Radio Shack? That was a chain of electronics stores. And we were things like, how to make an RS-232 cable, which was a communications cable for, connecting to a modem, which is something that you used to have to use to connect with other people, or how do you make and then we ended up deciding we could write these little books on individual Unix utilities. And they were, often 50 or 60 pages. So they were really more like pamphlets. And eventually, we grew up into being a full-scale publisher, but a lot of it was because we were quick. We would write these little short books, and one of the bestsellers, our earliest bestseller, was a book on something called UUCP, the Unix to Unix copy program, which was basically a dial-up precursor to the internet. UUCP and Usenet. Usenet was sort of a distributed bulletin board. And you literally would call people in the middle of the night. You'd have a time slot, for your script, and you'd have 15 minutes to exchange as much email and information as you could in your 15-minute slot. And it was sort of a store and forward network. And that was really when we realized we were onto something. The book costs, I think, $7 or $8. This little pamphlet on UUCP, and we would get people calling us up from Europe, which was at the time a long distance call cost you $5 or $10, and they wanted us to DHL it over to them for another $40 or $50. And we go, oh, people really want this information badly. We're underselling it. And but also we did a turn every time we reprinted. We just updated the book. In a lot of ways, it was one of the first. It was pre-Wikipedia, but it was really crowdsourced in the sense that people would send us in comments, because the UUCP and this other one of our popular books was about something called TermCap, which was a database for how you how you could write programs that would work on all these incompatible screens. Right. This is originally written by Bill Joy. And it's part of it was part of the infrastructure that made VI work, his visual editor. And people would so you had to know stuff about individual devices. So with UUCP you had to talk to probably hundreds of different modems or different types of devices. And, somebody would send in a thing, say, oh, here's the chat script for an AT&T 5610 port contender. And I go, I don't have one of those, but I'll trust this person and I'll put it in there. And so the book grew from 60 pages to a couple of hundred pages, really through people sending in, tips and advice. And so anyway, that was sort of part of the history. Of course, today, publishing is really a pretty small part of our business. We're mostly an online learning platform. But again, the books are a big part of it. But we don't think of ourselves as a publisher anymore.
So as you moved along from your journey in consulting and then to publishing and then like an online platform, where along that journey did you guys discover that like animals would be your mascot? Because I always thought that was really iconic.
Well, it was sort of interesting because it was when our first 7 books, first of all, we were totally homegrown. Our very first 2 books, we actually had what's called a die cut cover. Like you actually had a little cut in the cover so you could see through to the title page what was the title of the book, and that was so we could print more covers and use them on different books. Right? Again, we were super cheap. The first print run of our first book was 100 copies. It wasn't like we were out there, and it was funny because I remember once, this is many years later, I was at there was a computer book, publishing conference organized by one of the computer book agents, and there were hundreds of computer book publishers and lots of books, but they were all mostly doing PC books, and we were like this rare outlier. And I gave this talk about some of our books, and like learning the VI editor, which later became Vim. First print run 100 copies. It was one of our first books. But I put up a picture up there, up on the screen, and said, "How many copies do you think this is sold?" And everybody laughs because nobody's ever heard of it. And I go, "Well, it's now up to 750,000." And they were like, "What?" And it was that kind of thing. We just did the things that we thought were needed. And we kept at them, whereas the typical model of publishers was you're looking for the bestseller, and if it's not a big bestseller, you throw it away. We were like, no, we're producing documentation that people need, so we just kept selling it and updating it, and so things went from 100 copies to 1,000 copies to, our print, so. And eventually we ended up with a bunch of multi-million copy bestsellers, but it was over time. Now, our first really big, like 1 million copies in 1 year was the whole Internet User's Guide and Catalog in 1992, which was the book that introduced the World Wide Web to the world and really was about the commercialization of the Internet. But that was also when we started doing other things. We actually created the first web portal before Yahoo. We created the first PC-based web server, which we sold. It was actually quite a hot business for us for about 3 years until Microsoft, who had been sort of promoting us, suddenly said, "Oh, we need to do that too, right? We're going to have to kill you." But that was sort of one of the things that is always interesting. When you're out front, you really have to be able to move fast, or you have to sell out. That's why when we created GNN, which was this first web portal, I didn't really want to take venture capital, and that was mainly because I had been, as a consultant, I'd been around a lot of startups that had ended up getting really boring really fast, and I just wanted to do interesting work. And so I didn't want to take venture capital because I felt like it would basically, the company would either become boring or would fail, one way or other, but it'd be out of my control. So so with GNN, we were on a rocket, and I read this book called Marketing High Technology by this guy Ron Davidow, and he had this appendix called The Math of Market Domination. And he said, if you want to dominate a market, you have to be at least half the market and growing faster than the market as a whole. And I went, there's no way we can do that as a self-funded company. So we're going to have to sell. So instead we sold GNN to AOL, and it was really the first content transaction of the internet era. My mistake then was, of course, that once I got to know AOL a little better, I realized they were really not going to, they were not going to be the winner. And so we sold our stock. Of course, if we'd hung on to the peak, it would have been worth a heck of a lot more. But I guess the basic thing that I would say for all of you, I think probably the biggest takeaway you should have from my career is that it's important to do what you love and have fun, and not get caught up in there's this sort of idea that being an entrepreneur is all about these giant exits. And I didn't want to exit. I wanted to do work that I enjoyed, and I wanted to do it, under my control. And I built a successful company. If I had exited, I might have more money, but then I would have just had to I would have to start over, And, one of the, I'm 71 now, and one of the things you realize is like, you only need so much money, and we have all these crazy people who are there, just piling money on money beyond any possible use. And it doesn't make them happy. Does Elon Musk look like a happy person? Not to me. He looks incredibly unhappy. And that's not to say that, some people, luck into big fortunes, but I think Silicon Valley has become way too much about the money and not as much about the work. And, I think, you want to have an entrepreneurial spirit, but you also want to have the idea of what you want, or the change you want to make in the world, and why what you do matters. I think about, and sometimes, of course, you start something and for kind of this wacky reason, and then it grows into something more. I think about the founders of 11 Labs. When I talked with Matty, he was telling me what they were doing originally. These guys from Poland, and they were just like pissed off. In Poland, the movies are dubbed by one voice actor who does all the voices. Right? And they go, this is really stupid. And when they saw AI, they went, we could fix that. So that's like somebody who wants to solve a real problem. And of course, they start from that problem, and then they go, oh, wait, there's all this more we can do with, speech synthesis. But I love entrepreneurs who really, are not going, wow, what's the thing I could do that will get me my investors? And I hate being in Silicon Valley, and you say, what do you, how's your company doing? And they say, oh, we just did our C round. And I go, that's not how your company's doing. That's about how much money you raise. It's not like, did you, talk to me about how many customers you've helped, I started my company with $500, and I never raised any money except through exits. We sold various divisions, or, like when we sold GNN and got AOL stock and eventually sold that, we also eventually built a little venture capital arm, and we funded Blogger and sold that to Google, and and so things like that. But the point was that we've always just been like, we're trying to do this interesting work. So look for interesting work that you want to do and that you want to make happen. And yes, there's going to be some set of people whose the interesting work is being a financial engineer of some kind. But, for most people, you want to build things that make a difference in other people's lives.
That was an amazing response, Mr. O'Reilly. And I think for a lot of the people in Hack Club and our community in general who have like an entrepreneurial spirit, that's exactly the right approach to be going about things, especially when, money seems to be at the center of everything. But really being a hacker and being creative is really where it's at.
I mean, a hacker is somebody who does things for love. I gave a talk once called "Why I Love Hackers," and I ended with this poem by Rainer Maria Rilke, the German poet, and it's about this story from the Bible in which Jacob is wrestling with the angel who he knows he can't beat. And the end of the poem goes something like, what we fight with is so small, and when we win, it makes us small. What we want is to be defeated decisively by successively greater beings. And I kind of go, like work on hard problems. I kind of, and actually my wife now, Jen Palka, came up to me after I gave that talk. She said, I need to talk like that for my conference, which is a conference we were doing on what we call Web 2.0. And she said, but I need it for entrepreneurs, not hackers. And so I started doing this series of talks called Work on Stuff That Matters. And because that was sort of in the Facebook era, and there was sort of everybody was just making these sort of really trivial apps that were, maybe making the money, but not really meaningful. So anyway, I'm kind of feeling like right now we're in this amazing transformation, of our industry with AI. And, the thing that, that sort of bothers me a little bit about Silicon Valley, there doesn't seem to be a lot of thinking about how do we make the world better with this technology. I mean, there's sort of high level chatter about it, but basically what most people are doing is, what's the opportunity that I can get funded that I can turn into a multi-billion-dollar exit, and it just twists the way you think about what you ought to be doing. And I think the bubble will end, and it's not. The bubble will end really because the kinds of things that most people are working on right now are kind of winner takes all. There's going to be one or two really good, coding agents. For example, you think about, here's this new technology of LLMs, large language models. And, there's been this sort of narrative that, this is this utterly unprecedented technology. Whoever gets to artificial general intelligence first, and maybe artificial superintelligence, is going to change everything, and there's going to be one winner. And then, it turns out that's maybe not the case. And it's a powerful technology, but there's this great concept from these guys, Arvind Narayanan and Sayesh Kapoor at Princeton. They wrote a paper recently called AI as Normal Technology. And their argument is that normal technology has 4 stages. There's an invention, and then it has to get turned into products. And then people have to figure out how to, it's the whole idea of product market fit is not product market fit for VCs. It's actually figuring out, how do you solve real problems for people? And then you have all these adoption issues. What are the obstacles to adoption? How does the thing change society? How does it get adapted? What are the opportunities that come out of that? And we're just at the very beginning of that. So if you think about AI right now, there's really about 5 product classes. There's this general purpose chatbot like ChatGPT. There's there's coding agents, where Claude started out as a general purpose chatbot, and they pivoted. And then there's a whole class of people who are in that space competing to be, the coding tools, and that will eventually shake out, and there'll be 1 or 2 that are left. And then there's kind of with Notebook LM, there's a kind of product class that's for office workers, that's maybe for document management. Perplexity is trying to reinvent search. But there's this huge unexplored product space of what can you actually do with AI. And I was talking with a well-known Chinese investor recently, and it was just interesting. He was talking about the differences between, the AI startup scene in China versus the U.S. And, he was like, okay, here's what the market structure is like in China right now. The big internet giants who were kind of in disfavor with the government are now back in favor. And they're really just dominating anything consumer, right? So there's not really much opportunity for startups there. Chinese enterprises don't like to pay for enterprise software, so there's not much opportunity there. So he says, so everybody here is working on robotics and embodied AI, and he said, we're way ahead of the US already in things like drug discovery. And I thought that was super interesting. But, it's just that kind of idea. So we're in this phase of trying to, what are we going to do with this new technology? And I would really recommend, if you guys want to think about being entrepreneurs, study past entrepreneurial revolutions, because there's a lot to learn, because the pacing of how a technology rolls out can really affect whether you're a winner or a loser. So for example, just like if you look at the automobile, it's like there were early startups that were doing things like, oh, wait, we could put headlights on these things that are not gas lamps, that are actually, a light that's run by, an alternator like we have in a car today, right? But there was a problem. In order for the alternators to work, you had to be able to go fast enough, and the roads were so bad that you often couldn't go fast enough to charge the battery or to run the lights. So there's all these wackadoodle kind of conditions that can make the right idea too early. We see that right now with AI chips as a bottleneck. We see that with power as a bottleneck. So there often are bottlenecks. And so the good idea can't actually, work till much later than you think. And then there's the whole issue about adoption. I just saw this crazy. I just did an interview with the founders of Google Docs, which had its 20-year anniversary, and it's so interesting because Claudia, who was really did a lot of the UI for it, she's like, I still remember the moment when I realized we don't actually have to have Control S for save. We don't have to have a save menu. We can just do it automatically. And just that realization. And then I saw an announcement just the other day that just now Microsoft is basically making saving to the cloud automatic. It's just like, you've got to be kidding me. It's just so things take a long time often. So here were these people. First of all, the idea that you could do that thing of just sort of saving to what was the cloud, all these pieces start coming together and new things become possible, and you start being able to think about them and see, oh, wait, here's this thing that we could do differently.
That's really interesting. And all of the stuff that you're saying makes a lot of sense, and how this new innovation comes along. But as we speak about AI and the sector that you're in, and we see people around us claiming that AI is going to transform the world, or it's going to change everything we know about industry, we were curious about your experience with your AI disclosures project. It seemed like it's doing a lot of good, and it's something that many members of Hack Club would like to emulate or get involved in the future. So could you tell us a little bit about the project, your successes with it, and how interested students can help the cause?
Okay, well, yeah, let me start with where did it come from? I've always sort of been kind of this idealist on the fringes of this industry in a certain way. And one of the things, are you guys familiar with Cory Doctorow's concept of enshittification? No, so he's basically like, here's the pattern of what we see on the internet. Companies start out, they're really good to their users because you get the whole pattern is you get lots and lots of users, and that's how you get success. But then once you get, you get to the knee of the S curve, right? And you're not, you're not acquiring users is no longer the magic lever. You start to try to extract value from your users, and you start basically, selling out your users to your enterprise customers, or whatever. For example, so with ad-based businesses, they start, basically privileging the advertisers, and then the idea is that eventually, you've got to keep growing, and then you start screwing your business customers, and as he puts it, and then you die. But just think about the history. You guys are all young enough, you probably haven't seen it, but like for people my age, we remember when Google was better. We remember when even like things like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, they were really vibrant and powerful. And then the companies are like, we got to make them worse in order to make more money. And anyway, so I've always been on this long before Corey coined that term, but it's just a very good term in shitification. But I started looking at the role of companies using their algorithms all these companies are gatekeepers, and they use their algorithms to allocate human attention. So I started looking at this whole idea of marketplaces for attention. I had a project at University College London, which is about what I called algorithmic rents. Now rents are unearned income, and in economics, and this idea of companies using their algorithms to get more than they should. And so we were looking in particular at Amazon, which again used to have the promise to its users, we will find you the best product at the lowest price. And now they discovered advertising, and now we actually did a bunch of empirical work and looked at and go, the top advertised products are, on average ranked a third lower than the best organic products, and they cost 17% more. So they're screwing their users in order to basically collect these advertising rents. And Google, similar thing, they're giving more and more space to ads and less to organic results. So I just sort of, in trying to look at that and document that, I started saying, well, we have all these memories, and we have some anecdotal data about how Google used to work, how Amazon used to work, what the results used to look like. And I go, okay, so now we're starting this game over again with AI. So I'd wrote this paper. It was called Algorithmic Attention Rents, whatever. And the ending of the paper was, what will we wish we had known, when these companies all start going to the bad? What will we wish we had them disclose? Because of course, if Google and Amazon had been forced to disclose, we can look back and say when Google went public, it made this much money, but we can't look back and say when Google went public, it had this optimization function for its search. So what were the internal operating metrics that were guiding their behavior? And so we started saying we should really start pushing for that. And then I say, so we're here. So we started the AI Disclosures Project with this idea of, could we understand what ought to be disclosed? Now, I think as we've progressed from that fundamental idea, I've been thinking a lot more about some other aspects of disclosures, which really are that in some sense, every functioning market has a system of disclosures. And we have this idea that I think is kind of comes from this sort of overly legalistic framing of disclosures, which is, we're going to tell you something. We're going to mandate that you tell us what's in this drug. You ever think, if you get a prescription, you look at this big wad of paper and you throw it out. You don't look at it. It's a totally useless set of disclosures. But I can tell you a really useful set of disclosures. You're driving on a windy road, and there's a sign that says, next curve is very sharp and it's 15 miles per hour. Right? That could save your life, and it's really useful. Or if you drive too fast, if you drive more than 55 miles an hour, you might get pulled over and get a ticket. So I started thinking, okay, so here's this set of disclosures that are practical and applied. And so I started thinking, well, every networking protocol is a system of disclosures like that. So I started thinking about functional disclosures. So like, your web browser contacts a web server and it says, hey, I'm Chrome. And as a result, the server, which says, hey, I'm Apache, they each know something about each other and what the capabilities are. And so then you start looking ahead at AI and you go, well, what is MCP but a system of disclosures? This is the tool. These are the tools that I have that you can call. In some sense, it's kind of like, it's sort of a shim between, often, just an MCP is, server is really just a shim between a bunch of of APIs or tools that are available, and with some additional language to make it easier for a visiting AI agent to know what's available and what you can do there. So those are functional disclosures. And anyway, the thing that I'm kind of interested in is what's the intersection between those two ideas, because the idea of functional disclosures and protocols is really useful. And then the question is, how could you graft on this idea of how would you understand when those things go wrong? Like, so there are some, so I don't know what that's going to be for AI. I really don't. You do know that in general, when people want to do things badly, they stop telling you about them. So a good example that we've used is, okay, so persuasion. In the early days of AI, when they were worried, they've all watched the movie Inception about, not Inception, was it? What was the one? Yeah, maybe it wasn't Inception. Well, I can't. Maybe I'm mixing up the names. But where the AI, the robot, persuades somebody to let him out. And so there's this idea that persuasion is a risk. And so in the early system cards for all the AI models, they were saying here's we're measuring persuasion, and we've done these things to dial it down. And then suddenly they go, oh, actually, we want persuasion as part of our business model. They stop reporting on that. So in some sense, just knowing what people disclose and then stop disclosing kind of tells you something about their their changes of intention. When Facebook stopped saying, oh yeah, we're going to give you what you want, we're going to instead give you what we want, that they've gone to the bad. And I guess the question is, how could we persuade? I guess I thought that there was a chance at one point possibly to persuade regulators to think about those kinds of issues, but they got all caught up in the this sort of existential risk of AI stuff, which I think was overblown, and didn't think enough about the real business risks, which are just people abusing their their market power.
There's like a lot of conversation I think hack clubbers are also interested in, which is like the existential risk component of AI, but there's also like the just catastrophic risks that come from, let's say, like deep faking to make political propaganda or disinformation, or even creating like 0-day cyber attacks, all these other litany of risks. So my question to you is, how do you think us as companies, us in like this race dynamic that Congress sees us in, should be approaching regulating this technology?
Yeah, first off, I do think that there are real risks there. I don't know that I think they've been overhyped in the, in some ways it served the companies to overhype those risks. Like if you look at, we had the sort of social media panic, and when people have really gone back and said, okay, how much did social media really affect the 2016 election? Not really a lot of evidence, and I've always sort of said, look, if I we're trying to figure out misinformation, and I had my choice of getting rid of Fox News or getting rid of Facebook, I get rid of Fox News. I mean, it's sort of like, there was this really great study by a group at Harvard where they just looked at Twitter, but they basically said, look, if you look at misinformation, it starts, all kinds of misinformation tends to start on the edge, and in the, again, I'm revealing a bit of my politics here, but in the left-leaning media, the mainstream media outlets tend to tamp down the misinformation. They have their own version of it, but it's not. I'm not saying they're perfect, but their study was like, okay, so there's some wackadoodle rumor, they tamp it down. Whereas on the right, they tend to amp it up, and they could just show this on Twitter. So that the whole thing, like you think about say there was this whole thing about so-called Pizzagate, the pizza parlor that had it's not even a basement in the place. And it's like, there's all these stories. You can go there and you can look and there's no basement. How could there be a child smuggling ring in the basement of a place that doesn't have a basement? And so people who are, in regular media would, go, look, this is just doesn't hold any water. There's nothing there. Yet it has persistent life in right-wing media, because they're not actually about being a media outlet. They're about being, amplifying misinformation. So I guess all I'm saying is it's in the business model, not in the technology. So here's the people whose business model is to make people angry, to make people polarized. And, maybe you'll make them more powerful, but I don't think that the fundamental problem is the technology itself. Technologies that we think of as utterly banal today were used very badly. I mean, radio was a big factor in Hitler's rise to power. He was a master of using radio, and television or film. I mean, Leni Riefenstahl, Triumph of the Will, all that kind of stuff. That was, that was the technology that was going to make the world. On the one hand, this is going to make the world all better, and then no, it's going to make the world terrible. So we do eventually figure out how to, solve for these things. I grew up, in the era when it was atomic energy that was the devil. You kind of, every new technology that's very powerful comes with a lot of risks. The fundamental thing that we have to control for are the people who are using the technology, not the technology itself. I don't have the idea that I think AI is in itself dangerous in the way that people have feared. Now, let's see. We could be wrong. It could be different. But I think that some of that's overblown.
Thank you, Tim, so much for your time and responses to all of our questions. And as we're approaching the end of the AMA, since your beliefs for open sourcing, safe AI development, and like opening up the world of programming for everyone, it aligns perfectly with the Hack Club's mission. So what are some like final thoughts that you want to leave with all of the hackers who are watching this video?
Well, first off, I would say, do you guys know who Ethan Mollick is? Go check him out. He's a professor he's a business school professor at Wharton, but he writes very intelligently about AI. And he wrote a great essay recently called The Bitter Lesson versus the Garbage Can. And the bitter lesson is this concept that was coined, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago about AI, and it's that we think that human expertise really matters. And the fact is, brute force, and better algorithms tend to win. And this has been true long before AI. I mean, when we did the first web portal, GNN, the Global Network Navigator, it was a map, and we thought we're publishers. We're going to curate the best sites on the internet. And then Yahoo came along and said, well, we're just going to list them all. And then Google said, no, we know what all means. We're going to list them all, and that algorithmic curation won. So that was a version of the bitter lesson. But the bitter lesson today is there's all these capabilities that come for free with AI. And at my company, I'm always like, people are like so wedded to the way they've done things before. And you guys are young, you're coming along, you're growing up with AI, so you're not going to have to learn the bitter lesson in the same way necessarily that about AI that we do, which is that, oh, wait, why are you doing that when, like I'm always saying to, my people, like, why are you doing it that way when you can just do this with, with AI? We have to start asking ourselves, okay, if this comes free with AI, despite the fact that used to be your core expertise, that doesn't matter anymore. right? That comes free for everybody now. So what are the things that only we can add to it? So I guess I would just sort of say, as you get out there and play on that edge with the latest tools, keep asking yourself, okay, what do people add to this? What can I, as a human being, add for other human beings? And that's why I do think that we have to. This is not going to come from people who are chasing the main chance of what's going to make me the most money. It's going to be people who are solving curious problems for themselves and their friends, and some of those things turn out to be new possibilities that nobody ever thought about or cared about. I guess I would just say the experience of my career of being in technology for 40, 50 years, the biggest and most interesting things that have happened have come from hackers who are just doing things for curiosity, for love, for beauty. And they sometimes, just turn into something really big and powerful. But when you go questing for it, you often actually you're trying to build something for the world that has now been superseded. So just go out there and kind of have a good time with all the stuff that's in front of us. And when I say have a good time, also you have to be aware of the social implications. We are in a world with serious challenges. And I think a lot, about climate, for example, and you kind of go, we have this crazy consumer culture, which sort of seems to think it can go on forever, and maybe it won't. Again, that comes from me, in my life, from being somebody who studied the fall of Rome, and here was this great civilization, and then it collapsed. Why did it collapse? What happened? Well, so thinking about history and how the world changes, and it sometimes changes painfully. And our job is, wherever we are, is just to be prepared for whatever comes and to try to make things better than we found it.
It's a beautiful message for all of us to have in mind. There is actually a question from the live audience that I'll put up if everyone can see, and I'll read it out loud for all of us. Mr. O'Reilly, if you could rewrite the history of tech from 1995 to now with one change, a fork in the road where we went wrong, what moment would you pick and why? And this question is from Shoria.
Yeah, I have to say I do have one of those fork in the road moments, but it's not really in technology, and it's not in the period from 1995 till now. It's in actually the 1980s, and it is when this economist named Milton Friedman wrote this sort of essay called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Reward its Shareholders." The idea was that company management shouldn't care about social issues. They should just give money back to their shareholders, and their shareholders would worry about that. And then these two Harvard Business School professors, Meckling and Jensen, came up with the idea that the real way to make that work, this is in the 80s, the real way to make that work is if you align the interests of shareholders, if you basically pay managers in stock with stock options, then they will have the interests of the shareholders in mind because they have the same interests. And that's when we created what I think of as the first rogue AI. And I wrote about this in my book, WTF, because at that point, we made a machine that said the stock must go up. That is the one job that every company has. It's no longer to please customers. It's no longer to, think about social issues, impact of, it's not to, you can't worry about employees. There's only one thing you can serve. And it's this sort of this notion of shareholder primacy. And it's kind of, it is in fact, I think, part of what went wrong in Silicon Valley, because Silicon Valley is all about that. But I think in general, it's really ruined the economy by making we have made, if you guys are familiar with this idea of the paperclip maximizer, from in AI, came from Nick Bostrom originally, but we have made all of our companies into paperclip maximizers. Except the paperclips they're trying to make are stock price go up. And we're now in the kind of crazy end game part of that where fraud is a big part of the landscape. Because if you can it doesn't matter, make the stock go up no matter what. And I think I think why we're our current system is breaking down, and why I think in some ways the world economy is really due for a reset. And I keep thinking that climate will give that to us, but it's probably not going to give it to us. It's going to be over the next few decades. It's not going to be right now. Where we're going to have to say, oh yeah, actually there are other things that matter besides make stock market go up.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really insightful. And I definitely agree with you that that was one mistake that was made in the past. I
Yeah.
guess as we are wrapping up on our time here, and I get to ask my final question to you, I was curious about your thoughts, as you mentioned, about being ethical around the development of AI, particularly as we go into the next era of AI with AGI and some kind of advanced supermodels. I was wondering whether you think this development would be a net positive or a net negative, and why you would think that.
Well, I guess first off, I'm not 100% sure that we're on the path to AGI, but if we are, I think that I think we do run a real risk if we, I guess the way I think about it is, you're raising kids. How do you teach them values? You teach them partly by example, right? Like if you just tell them things and what you do is not what you tell them, they figure out pretty quickly. And I have to say, if we do achieve AGI and it has independence, it's going to look at us and probably it's not going to get good values from our society, because our society has a lot of broken values. And people are expressing the kind of behavior that we would not want an AI to have. So I like to say AI is a mirror, not a master. So we should be looking at what does it show us about ourselves, and hopefully we can learn from that before it's too late.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. O'Reilly. We've had a great time.
Oh, you can call me Tim, by the way.
Yeah, we've had a great time, Tim, talking about the beginnings of O'Reilly Media, the transition online, and then also the social implications of AI in today's world. So if anyone in the audience is interested in more AMAs like this, join us at hackclub.com. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.